Cocteau. Igor Stravinsky was a man of order. He could find it anywhere. Jean Cocteau said, "As soon as you begin talking to this man, everything is numbers, and disorder ceases." Hollywood is chaos, particles of dust blown by the desert winds. For an artist like Stravinsky, Hollywood was both a disappointment and a challenge. Without forces to constrain his imagination, he found himself free to consider all possibilities. But without some underlying order, he was lost. Eventually, he reached a crisis, a failure to find the order that had guided him in the past. Perhaps he sensed that his old ways of creating were failing. New modes would be needed. He looked within himself and without. He looked in the desert. He looked into the abyss. In 1938, Igor Stravinsky was considered by many to be the greatest living composer. It was a reputation he had won in Paris one night in 1913, when the scandal of the Sacre had brought him instant notoriety, capping a successful trilogy of ballets for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. In the years just before this, Stravinsky had enjoyed a period of relative calm and creative prosperity. One might say that the whole world had. But now things were starting to close in on him. Stravinsky was not Jewish, but his music was being swept up with the other composers of so-called degenerate music, and performances were becoming few and far between. Added to that, his family was falling apart through sickness and death. Within the space of just 6 months in 1939, Igor Stravinsky lost his aging mother, and his wife and eldest daughter both died to tuberculosis, a disease he himself had struggled with since birth. An ocean away, Walt Disney was making a full-length animated film in which he would create a new style of motion picture presentation, one in which music would be given a new prominence. In fact, the animations would be made to the music, and not the other way around. When Stravinsky's infamous Sacre du Printemps was suggested as accompaniment to scenes of prehistoric life, Disney jumped at the idea. Stravinsky, who had visited Hollywood once before, saw his future mapped out in front of him. Perhaps this would present the opportunity for him to become once again the center of gravity for a new art form, another Paris maybe, this time for an even bigger audience, bigger fame, bigger fortune. But Disney held the upper hand. The Rite of Spring, being Russian, was not covered by copyright in the United States, and Disney could use the music as he chose without permission. In the end, he offered $6,000 to keep things above board, and to use Stravinsky's name. So, with war in the air and personal crisis assailing him from every side, Stravinsky took a bold step into his future. On the 22nd of September 1939, he boarded the SS Manhattan, bound for New York and America. It was just 3 weeks after Germany invaded Poland. Stravinsky was 57 years old in 1939, and he had been carrying on a more or less open relationship with his mistress, Vera de Bossé-Sudeikina, for some 20 years. When his wife died, he was free to pursue it in a more direct way. Vera arrived in the United States in the early spring of 1940. They quickly headed out to Hollywood together to check up on progress with his film, now entitled Fantasia. What he saw and heard shocked him. His score had been severely truncated and rearranged, and he found the animations to be silly concoctions. But Stravinsky was powerless to complain. Yet for all his dissatisfactions, the use of his music in Fantasia went a long way towards bringing his name to a large and largely new audience. That the music was his most striking and controversial score didn't hurt either, even if it was already more than 25 years old. With Fantasia under his belt, $6,000 richer, and without having had to write a note of music, Stravinsky might well have thought that his prospects in Hollywood were rosy indeed. But there were certain realities of the Hollywood studio system that he would yet have to learn. Stravinsky and Vera settled into this house in Hollywood, high above Sunset Strip on Weatherly Drive. It was to remain their home for the next almost 30 years. They were married in this small Russian Orthodox church nearby. Stravinsky lived in Hollywood longer than in any other one place. He lived there in the first house he ever owned, and his years there saw the emergence of his late-period works, an artistic rebirth rare in any artist and almost unheard of in one in his 60s. Hollywood was a culturally rich town in 1939, and the Stravinskys soon found themselves surrounded by movie stars and literati of all stripes. Author Franz Werfel was typical of the expat community. An Austrian Jew, Werfel had fled after the Anschluss and settled in Hollywood. En route, he had stopped in Lourdes and been struck by the story of the young girl Bernadette Subaru, who claimed to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary in a cave in the town. Werfel ended up writing a book about her, Song of Bernadette, which became a big bestseller when it was published in 1941. 20th Century Fox quickly decided to make it into a movie. The studio turned to Stravinsky, who seemed the perfect composer for such a prestige project. But as with many dreams dreamt in Hollywood, this one didn't pan out. Stravinsky wrote some music, but it was never used. For Stravinsky, the composer was king, and he would not permit so much as a single note to be altered in his scores. This was an untenable state of affairs within a studio system that considered even writers to be easily expendable. Composers ranked far lower still. In the end, Stravinsky recycled music he had conceived for the apparition of the Virgin scene as the middle movement of his symphony in 3 movements, a work now considered to be his first large-scale American work. Today, placing this music into the scene for which it was composed, although it is doubtful Stravinsky ever would have seen this before composing it, we can get an idea of how it might have worked and how it might not have. Stravinsky was also involved in several other movie projects, although none of them came to any better resolution than Bernadette. Jane Eyre, with screenplay by Stravinsky's friend Aldous Huxley, and starring Orson Welles, was another prestige project for which Stravinsky might have seemed perfectly suited. Stravinsky immersed himself in the world of Bronte and composed several cues, but again his music was not used. Here's the scene where Jane first encounters Rochester, synced with Stravinsky's Ode, which he recycled from his work for this film.
Can I do anything?
Stand out of the way.
I'm sorry I frightened your horse.
Apologies won't mend my ankle. Down, violence! Well, what are you waiting for?
I can't leave until I see you're fit to ride.
A will of your own. Where from?
From Mr. Rochester's house just below.
You know Mr. Rochester?
No, I've never seen him.
You're not a servant at the hall.
I'm the new governess.
Oh. The new governess.
With America now firmly committed to the wars in Europe and Japan, there were any number of propagandistic films being made by the studios. Stravinsky was approached to compose for two of them, North Star and Commandos Strike at Dawn. In both cases, Stravinsky composed some music, and in both cases his work was not used. His music for Commandos became his 4 Norwegian moods.
Now you can turn around.
Your wedding cake. Oh, how beautiful. Oh, thank you.
Make a wish.
I will.